Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, veuillez accueillir, please welcome Greg Clark, Marc de la Vergne, en conversation avec, in conversation with Carla Bailo.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Great turnout here, and I apologize if you were in the last session. I was there too, so you're going to have to listen to me twice. We're going to be talking about something really quite provocative. What is a car-free city? What does that look like, and how can we make that happen? I can't see many of you very well, but how many of you love your daily commute? Love it. Whatever way you choose, by your car, by public transit. Yeah, I'm not seeing so many hands. That means, even though I've been in the automotive industry for a long, long time, perhaps we haven't done the best job in customer experience. So we'll talk about that and a lot of other topics in the next 20 minutes. So with me today, I have Greg Clark, who's the Senior Advisor, Future Cities, HSBC, and also Marc de la Vergne, who's the Chief of Mobility Innovation for the City of Detroit. Detroit, Carfree. Boy, that's an oxymoron, isn't it?
Quickly assumes that.
So I have a couple opening questions for both of you, and then we'll go into the panel. So Greg, first, when we think about city living, we have to think about really what kinds of transportations we need, how we design that urban area so that we can have the multimodality that we crave. How do we change our habits and our typical way of designing cities and transport solutions?
Carla, I think we have to start with just a little bit of history, right? So humankind has a 40,000-year history. For 13,000 of those years, we've had cities. For 100 of those 13,000 years, we've had cities that are organized around the motor car. So it's a very, very tiny blip in the history of human settlement that the motor car is the kind of key technology. And of course, the motor car has, certainly in the last century, been a symbol of freedom. It's been a symbol of wealth. It's been a symbol of success. But I think things are changing. And I think basically three things are changing. So the first thing is that, if you like, the case for reducing cars in the city is changing right now. It has been changing for a while. There's been a strong kind of anti-congestion, anti-sprawl lobby for quite some time. We've had lots of reports about the ill health that comes from sitting in a car for long periods of time. But just recently that's changed because jobs in the economy are re-urbanizing, because we're much more aware of air quality and what that does to human health, and because we're more aware of the health of the planet and climate change. There's a shift in the case for and against the car that is happening in many places around the world. So I think that's one thing that's changing. The second thing is really about alternatives. On the one hand, because many cities in Asia and in the southern hemisphere are growing very rapidly, there's a new and perhaps refreshing focus on public transportation as the key organizing idea of the city. So I know in North America it may not always be the most popular thing, but around the world there's renewed interest in public transportation. And secondly, of course, we have all these new modes of transport that are now coming. And thirdly, we have these new digital systems that enable us to integrate it. So we've got alternatives emerging. And then the third thing I think that's different is kind of people's attitudes. We're using nudge, we're using incentives, we're seducing people, I think, into doing things differently. And I think all of this adds up to a different kind of proposition where the idea of a car-free city is not as mad as it used to be.
Great points, and we'll delve into those more. Marc, when we talk about different modes of transit, I mentioned when I introduced you, Detroit is the motor city, that cars are how we get around. But when we talk about multimodality, how can that be monetized, and what are you thinking about in the city?
Thanks. So as we're all aware, public transit is a very profitable business that we as a city run, and we just sort of take money in, and I don't know the answer to the question on sort of how is it profitable, because we obviously run public transit at a loss. I think what we're really focused on, and like the innovation that what I'm trying to figure out is how do we make sure that we can help make new options, and whether those options are car share, bike share, scooters, whatever's coming in, making sure they're working for all Detroiters. There's a lot of great things happening in the city, and there's just more opportunities, there's more people, there's more parks, there's just more happening in Detroit, and we need to be able to provide more options. But a lot of times, the perception of private sector mobility provider doesn't necessarily always sort of keep up with the pace of what's happening on the ground. So we've got to be the one to help catalyze a lot of these new options. So whether that's being able to use the public right-of-way and share that with these companies, whether it's working with them on how we can program some of these things and begin to fill in some of those revenue gaps, or whether it's basically saying, this new mode of transportation is having an impact on different businesses because they are making sure their employees are getting there. How can we get them involved in this conversation as well? That's what we're really beginning to focus on.
So downtown, you have the May Mobility shuttle. Have you learned anything from that so far since it started operation?
Sure. So May Mobility is an autonomous vehicle. It's in service. I kind of came to a realization that I don't know if it was good or bad that I've done stuff, though, because I was on a scooter behind an autonomous shuttle in downtown Detroit, and I was like, whoa, this is a different Detroit.
Holding on to it?
Yeah. I didn't go that far. That would have been a bad press story. But, I think that we're learning that, from a lot of people, that how they're interacting with autonomous vehicles on a daily basis, as well as it's beginning. Not everybody is downtown every day, but people are seeing the vehicles and becoming a little bit more comfortable with them. And I think there's a lot of change happening with transportation and with mobility. And one of the big challenges for cities is how do we approach this change with our residents, as opposed to just putting change out there, being able to talk to them, allow them touch, feel, and understand some of the fears that they might have with these new technologies.
So, Greg, what is a car-free city? I mean, I don't think it really means literally no cars, or maybe it does in your mind, but how do you define that?
Well, it might eventually mean no cars, but it doesn't at the moment. And I guess there's 3 or 4 or 5 different ideas. So one idea is there are certain zones within the city where you can't drive a car or you can't park a car. And that's also a choice. So you can't drive a car in certain pedestrianized areas in many cities in Asia. You can't park a car anymore in the center of Oslo. That's kind of interesting. There are certain vehicles that can't go into the city, and they might be vehicles of a certain size or a certain kind of engine. Or if you're Singapore, there are certain vehicles you can only take into the city every other day of the week or something like that. So there are certain geographies where you can't take it, certain kind of vehicles you can't take, or maybe at certain times of day that you can't take the vehicle into the city, or maybe you can only take the vehicle into the city if it's got a certain number of riders in it. So carpooling allowed, individual drivers not, or maybe it's just about being charged to take that car into the city. And I think that what's happening in all of these different modes, and there's a different approach in London where it's about the pollutants in the vehicles, or in Oslo, as I said, where it's about not being able to park, or Singapore, where it's about the particular vehicle and that license plate can't go in more than a certain number of days a week, or maybe it's Tokyo, where you're incentivizing it with costs. There's different ways in which they're reducing the number of cars in the city center, generally speaking. And the times of day and night is a very interesting aspect of this. There's an awful lot of cities now experimenting with car-free Sundays in cities.
Right.
So all of these are different models of how you get towards a car-free city.
So, Mark, I'm going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to append to that question just a little bit and say, what are the ramifications of that for mobility for all and access for all?
Yeah, so I don't think we've ever had a conversation of saying, like, how do we make Detroit car free?
Thank God.
We do have a lot of conversations around how do we make it easier for folks that can't afford a vehicle or choose not to own a vehicle. And from that is, like, we need to add a lot more options. And, we're doing a number of different pilots to better understand how things like bike share can be integrated with transit, how on-demand shuttles, micro-transit can begin to solve problems but also work as one system. Because we're very transactional focused on sort of beginning to get these things up and running, learning, iterating, and understanding how we can scale a bit. But there's also a bigger question of how does this all start to work together as one system? Because like having a lot of things is not anyone's goal. We're working on an effort right now with the World Economic Forum on seamless mobility, and I think we've touched on so many different things. And it was, we were working on data piece, we're working on equity piece, and it's going to be the challenge. And I don't think that there's an easy solution to saying how do we begin to make this with a lot less friction. But you go back to the early part about happiness. We want to say like, we have very simple goals. How do we make it safe, easy, and affordable for everybody to get around the city? And that's the guiding light. And we're not building our solutions around technology, but using technology to get to those outcomes.
Yeah. Let's talk about demographics for a minute. We talked earlier about the population of Detroit, for example, and the income there compared to, let's say, the San Francisco Bay Area, and how that then really influences the different kinds of mobility solutions you may provide. And I'm going to go to Greg first with this question, since you have a totally global perspective. How can you apply these modality solutions to different cities with different demographics, and even sometimes within cities, the different, micro communities within that city, to ensure really that you're providing an adequate solution for all?
Well, I think the first point you have to observe, Carla, is that cities that have a more integrated transport system tend to be less segregated cities. People of different incomes and different age groups live in the same neighborhoods when you've got a transport system that actually enables them to move between them. The more the city is dependent upon the private automobile, the more segregated the neighborhoods in the city are, generally speaking. But if you're thinking about, the world outside North America, of course, one of the demographics in Latin America is that, vehicle ownership is a symbol of wealth. Wealthy people drive cars, poor people take the bus, even poorer people hang on to the back of a truck. So there's been a big approach there to getting the car out of the main highways so that more forms of public transport can be used, and trying to move towards the idea that there's a shared transport system for everyone. Over in Asia, where you've got these very fast-growing cities, take Singapore and Hong Kong just as two examples, been a massive investment in the public transport system, and trying to make sure that people know how to use that as the core, but use all of the new modalities that Mark was talking about to connect with a public transport system that's high capacity, highly reliable, highly predictable, and actually affordable for people. So whether you drive a private car to get to the station, or whether you use a scooter, a bike, a walk, or a jitney bus or something, the idea of an integrated system. So I think what you're really seeing is different types of cities emerging. Some cities are cities where there's already an established public transport system, and you're building upon that with all the things Mark talked about. And some cities, you haven't really had a public transport system, but you're trying to make space for a more shared set of models. Some of them run by government, some of them run by business, some of them run by not-for-profits, and trying to create more of a system there. The key thing is, all of the cities in the world are gaining population, but they're not gaining land. So it's really important to have systems that people can share.
Yeah, so, for us, there's a lot of folks in Detroit that struggle with transportation and how they need to get there. That problem exists in many other places. It exists in New York, it exists in Chicago, it exists in LA. We might have a bigger focus on it, but, we share, we talk a lot with other cities on sort of this problem, and this is my anecdote of this is, we run a pilot with Lyft where, before 2014, there were no 24-hour bus service in Detroit. The mayor came in 2014 and said, this is insane, people need to get to work. So at this point, we have 12 24-hour routes when so many other cities are cutting that. But we still have gaps. So what we've been running is a pilot with Lyft, where we give you a credit to get you about a mile and a half if you get off the bus between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. It's a pilot, it's going well, we're learning, we're iterating. So we got a call from the MTA in New York one day, and basically said, listen, we see what you're doing. we have some of the outer boroughs, late at night, same thing, right? We have less service, and we spend an hour with them. And I told my staff afterwards, I was like, that's the first and last time New York City's ever going to call Detroit to ask for transit advice. But I think a lot of what we're learning and sharing and thinking through these issues is the same thing that other cities are trying to do to make sure that everybody is able to get to where they need to go.
Maybe there's one little point there, Carla, which is who thought that, North American and European and wealthy Asian cities would be learning from Latin American cities? But the introduction of bus rapid transit, the idea of a dedicated lane for the bus and buses that are predictable, fast, and affordable, that's a Latin American idea that basically is going all over the world now. So it's not only that New York learns from Detroit.
The other interesting thing is I talk to different municipalities is, everybody understands they need to do something for multimodality and needs to perhaps improve their infrastructure. The question always is how do I pay for it? How do I make this economically viable? And how do I convince the citizens, since I'm using their money fundamentally, that this is a good idea? And normally also cities invest 30, 50 years. It's long-term investments. But with technology, increasing so rapidly, how do you advise? And what are you learning from cities? And Mark, how are you perhaps, justifying some of the things that you want to do from an economic perspective?
I think there's 4 basic ways to pay for it. So if you integrate the transport system more, you can generate more revenue from it. Part of the reason that transit systems around the world don't generate the revenue they should is because it's a too fragmented system. So they're never aggregating the riders and aggregating the fare box. So there's something about integrated payment systems and integrated ticketing systems that if you can really organize that, you can generate more revenue. The second one, of course, is that transport is a form of urban planning. So it's in the real estate system where a lot of the value is created through infrastructure, transport infrastructure investment. So you have to find a way of tapping that. There are all sorts of ways of doing that. The third one, of course, is increasingly that data is a currency, and transportation data, how people move around the city and what happens through those journeys, is a commercializable data set. We're beginning to see that happening. And then, of course, the fourth thing, and maybe not so popular, is that you have to charge people the real costs of driving the car in the road, rather than just assume that the road is a free good that you pay for once a year with your taxes. And road user charging in many different forms is going to be the way that cities pay for public transport, at least in part in the future.
Interesting, and I have to ask the question, every time that we talk about paying for road usage, it gives a lot of people hives. You don't want to talk about that because, people just expect it, right?
Yeah.
So how do we change that dynamic, and what do we need to do government related? And maybe this will be our next question regarding standards and public policy. But let me ask Mark the same question about the economics.
So all of that, but that is, a lot of those are very hard politically. But there are, what we're focusing on sort of in the near term is there are others business models that people not being able to get there disrupt, right? You can't, hospital, doctor's appointments, people don't get there. If everyone could get there, what would that do to their revenue and their insurance? From a business standpoint, you invest dollars in training an employee for 2 months, and then that person's ride disappears after 2 months, and that's a sunk cost. To even schools, right? Like we have a partnership with our school district now where we don't run the schools or anything, but we provide some transportation to say, how can we keep kids in Detroit? Because a lot of kids live in the city and go outside the city. So we've started an after-school program and transportation, and there's revenue associated with that for having more students in the school, but also just the overall of keeping kids in schools, building better schools, and it just begins to have these impacts. And transportation isn't an outcome in itself, but it supports a lot of the outcomes that we're trying to drive in the city.
So what do we need to do in terms of public policy or building codes or things like this to really promote multimodality and prevent things like scooter-geddon. You know, if you were in Austin by chance for South by Southwest, most of us were nearly killed by scooters and people untrained to drive them. But you know, what do we need to do in that regard?
Well, maybe three things. One is that we need a model that captures all of the value and benefit that Mark was talking about, and that's not a typical cost-benefit analysis for a transport system,
Indeed.
Right? The benefit to public health, the benefit to public place, the benefit to public services, so that's important. The second thing is that really you need a kind of guiding mind. Every region or every city, you do need one board or institution or person who's trying to make the whole system work. And so many cities and metropolitan areas don't have that.
Yep.
And if you don't have that, you can't really integrate. And then the third thing is, of course, you have to have very progressive, agile regulation around all of these new forms of transport. Because if not, you can discover that, you know, deliveries to the office, because people are using new logistics systems, just clog up the roads all over again. So there are public goods at stake, including safety of pedestrians, with all of these new modes. We have to be very agile about how we regulate them.
Excellent.
The fourth thing is you got to have your
I
residents
can give
as
you
part of
2
it.
sentences. Go.
Yeah, you got to have your residents part of it. That's the fourth
Yeah.
thing. You can't just
Right.
sort of do it. You've got to do it with them.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Greg and Mark. Great panel discussion, and thank you, audience.
Thank you.